Good morning, Mr. Pretorius. Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Chair.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Molefe. Thank you.
Yes, we're ready. May the witness be sworn.
Yes, thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
My name is Popo Simon Molefe.
Do you have any objections to taking the prescribed oath?
I do not.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
I do.
Do you swear that the evidence that you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chair, perhaps this should have been done before Mr. Molefe was sworn, but there are a number of representatives of various parties here. May they place themselves on record?
Yes, let them do so. Thank you.
May it please you, Mr. Chairperson, I appear on behalf of Mr. Brian Molefe.
Thank you.
My name is Kenneth Tsatsawane from the Johannesburg Bar.
Thank you very much.
Morning, Deputy Chief Justice Sondo.
Good morning.
I appear on behalf of the Chinese entities, being CRRC E-Loco Supply and other related entities. My name is Tato Serot.
Thank you very much.
Morning, Chair.
Good morning.
Andrew Strachan from Norton Rose Fulbright, South Africa. We appear for Bombardier Transportation, South Africa.
Thank you very much.
Morning, Chair.
Good morning.
My name is Mitsui Sindlovu. I represent Transnet.
Transnet.
M&S attorneys.
Thank you. Looks like that is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, you have before you two Lever Arch files. They are the files which contain the statement and annexures to the statement of Mr. Molefe. It's Exhibit BB1A and BB1B.
Yes, thank you. The two Lever Arch files will respectively be marked Exhibit BB1A and BB1B. Thank you.
Mr. Molefe, at page 33 of Exhibit BB1A is a signature. Whose signature is that?
It is mine, sir.
And the document at pages 1 to 33, is that your affidavit before the chair?
1 to 33, yes, sir.
Subject to a few corrections which will be drawn to the chair's attention, are you satisfied that the contents of this document are true and correct?
I do, sir.
And we will very shortly draw your attention to a typographical error, Chair, that although it's a small error, is significant.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Molefe, what position do you occupy at present in relation to Transnet?
I am the chairman of the board of directors of Transnet.
And when were you appointed?
I was appointed on the 23rd of May, subsequent to the cabinet approval, and so appointed by Minister Pravin Gordhan.
Was that 2018?
2018, correct?
And you provide the statement and your evidence to the chair in your capacity as such, I understand.
That is correct, sir.
Just very broadly, what topics or what category of topics will your statement cover? You deal with that in paragraph 2 of your statement.
Essentially, the statement would cover what the board discovered when it came into office subsequent to its appointment. And we do so to the extent that we have been able to discover these things. I also informed the Commission of the remedial steps that the board had taken to, since its appointment, to correct the wrongs that it found in the company.
In the draft before, or it's not a draft, in the signed statement before the chair in paragraph 3, it reads, I hasten to state that I have personal knowledge of the happenings prior to my appointment to the board. Is that correct?
It is not correct. What is correct is that I have no personal knowledge, and this is what was in the initial draft, and I think something fell through the cracks as we were doing the final draft.
It appears so.
Yes.
The Rule 3.3 notices that were issued, Chair, mentioned the version that you see before you, that in fact the witness did have personal knowledge, and that's why, although a small correction, it's an important correction that needs to be made, which will be placed before you in a supplementary affidavit.
Thank you.
What is the status of Mr. Molefe?
At the time of the writing of this statement, Mr. Molefe was chairperson, the acting group CEO of Transnet. He had been appointed for a period of 6 months, and that period expired after midnight on the 30th of April. So, and the board had decided that it would not extend his contract. Accordingly, he is no longer the acting group CEO, and that would require that the necessary correction be made on that statement.
Do you have any comment in relation to Mr. Morwe's current status and how that came about?
The board of Transnet, when it heard that it would be required to present before the Commission on behalf of Transnet, it took a view that the perspective that informs its presentation would be that it would give full disclosure to the Commission of all matters that it was aware or it knew of, that it took a view that there was nothing to defend, because the purpose is to assist the Commission to find the truth and to make the necessary recommendations to the President. We also took the view that in making this full disclosure, therefore, we would endeavor to be as honest as possible. May I say that despite the fact that the term of contract of Mr. Molefe had come to an end, matters had come to our attention that suggested that there were matters that he would have been aware of, which we were not aware of, which were not fully disclosed. And even if we would have considered, in the unlikely event of us considering extending his appointment, we would still have taken the view that unless he embraced the perspective of the board of full disclosure, of telling the truth, the perspective that there is nothing to defend, we would not have been able to present him to the Commission as a representative of Transnet.
So,
Maybe, Mr. Pretorius, before you proceed, it looks like there may be no need to make a correction in regard to him, Mr. Molefi, because I see your affidavit was signed while he was acting Group CEO. So in regard to that part, maybe there won't be a need to correct anything. It may be enough that you have said that he is now no longer acting Group CEO.
As the chair pleases. However, later on,
Yes.
when we deal with the matters that we thought he would deal with, we
Yes,
would indicate that the new acting Group CEO
Yes.
would deal with those matters.
No, that's fine, yeah.
so it's a matter, Chair, for the present, not necessarily of correcting the statement, but
Yes.
of merely updating
Yes, no, that's fine,
and
yeah.
explaining what has happened since the statement was signed.
Yes,
and that
no,
will
that's
happen on several occasions during the course of the evidence.
No, that's fine.
Mr. Molefe, when you were appointed and you took office as the chair of the Transnet board, you clearly did so with an intent and purpose. And in paragraph 4, you give a background to how you would approach your tasks at Transnet and what personal attributes of yourself would qualify you to do so and would direct you in your tasks. Would you tell the chair about that, please?
Briefly, Chairperson, when I was asked to consider the appointment, I could not but accept and believing that this is being done in recognition of the commitment to good governance, the ethical leadership, responsible use of public funds, and the courage to confront the wrongs that happen in state companies and in the country. And I think for approximately 5 decades of my life, Chairperson, I was involved in the struggle for freedom, the struggle against oppression, exploitation of our people, and in favor of the restoration of the dignity of all South Africans and their human rights, to ensure that all of them enjoyed equality before the law. And in doing so, I continue to be inspired by the values and the principles of the Freedom Charter, which served as a cornerstone of my belief. And that Freedom Charter, its significance lies in the fact that it is a democratic document that was written or crafted by South Africans of all nationalities, all races, and one can truly say it contains cardinal democratic principles which provided a vision for a new South Africa as we see today and must still continue to build. And when I looked at some of, I reflected on some of its provisions and in relation to Transnet as an entity that I've been asked to chair, I could not but remember a provision that talks about the wealth of the country being shared amongst all those, all the people of South Africa. And looking at what was happening in the country where small sections of people, small cliques or groups were appropriating public funds, appropriating the wealth for themselves, I had to say that, but the Freedom Charter doesn't say this should be the case. The Freedom Charter says, let the wealth be shared amongst all the people. Clearly not amongst the thieves, amongst crooks, but the people of South Africa. Therefore, it had to be a wealth that benefit and better the lives of the ordinary people. Now, in the context of Transnet, Chairperson, which is a vehicle owned by the developmental state with a developmental agenda, it is expected that it has to be managed in a manner that the resources that it controls are used prudently and for the development of the country, and in particular the disadvantaged communities. The challenge that the country is facing now is that of huge unemployment amongst the young people, the youth of our country. The inequities that exist in respect of women, so we've got to deal with the challenges of gender equity, both in terms of their upward mobility within the company Transnet, but also in terms of their own economic empowerment and participation. Included, of course, would be other marginalized groups like the disabled people and the veterans who spend their lives serving this country in the military, both in statutory and non-statutory. Non-statutory being those military organs that existed before the advent of democracy in 1994. And now they've coalesced into a single national defense force, and they continue to become veterans, and therefore an entity like Transnet advancing the agenda of this developmental state would have had, therefore, has to take into account their interests as well.
Yes, you will deal later in your evidence.
So what am I saying therefore, Chairperson? When I was told, come, help us at Transnet, I didn't consider it to be only an honor, but it was a rare opportunity for me to join those who are working selflessly to turn around this very important vehicle that should drive stimulation and growth of the economy of South Africa and serve various other businesses, industries in our country.
Thank you, Mr. Molefe. You will give evidence in due course, I understand, in respect of both the extent to which, against the context that you've drawn, Transnet was able to fulfill its mandate in recent years, and the extent to which steps have been taken to ensure the fulfillment of the mandate that you have described.
One second, Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Pretorius.
In paragraph 5, you describe at a high level the role of Transnet in the South African economy. Would you deal with that, please?
Chairperson, the Transnet is a very complex organization, and it straddles easily the entire economic spectrum of South Africa. It is a very important, it provides a very important logistics and freight system for the country. A system necessary for the movement of goods and services. It is a custodian of the rail network and pipelines. It has also the Transnet Engineering, which is a very important component that does maintenance and also does manufacturing of locomotives. At this stage, mainly light locomotives for shunting, mainly in the mines. It does haulage of goods across the country, vital goods, which would include major export products such as iron ore, manganese, coal, and so forth. This is just at a high level. But it also plays a very critical role in the Southern African region because it connects countries like Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia. It assists with the port of Maputo. They move their goods through South Africa to our port terminals. Transnet also, as I said, controls the port and port terminals in South Africa. It also has a property division. It has got a huge property base that it controls. I think, therefore, I did say that it is critical to the advancement of the goals of the developmental state. To this extent, clearly, it contributes critically to the development of infrastructure, industrial capabilities, and it ensures that there's regional integration and ensures energy security through the transportation of multi-products such as diesel, jet fuel, petrol, from Durban to various parts, right? I think it goes right up to here into Heidelberg and Alberton, and from there it moves to other parts of the country.
Transnet is also the custodian of our ports.
It is the custodian of our ports, yes, sir.
In paragraph 6, you talk of the announcement by the President on 15 February 2018. Would you deal with that, please?
Chairperson, when we came into office as a new board, some of the first things we had to consider was what is the context in which this new board is being appointed. And it was the context that was, amongst others, characterized by this important development that on 15th of February 2018, President Cyril Ramaphosa was sworn in as the President of the Republic of South Africa. And as was articulated in his speech, and indeed, as was perceived by many South Africans, his appointment represented the ushering in of a new dawn for South Africa. It created high expectations amongst our people. But what was this new dawn, as was seen by him and ourselves? We saw a new dawn, the new dawn as the beginning of the recognition and acknowledgement of the wrongs of the past. We had spent many years denying that things were going wrong. His coming into office began to provide a new paradigm that says, indeed, things are not what they should be. Things have gone wrong. There has been a systematic weakening and or destruction of vital organs of the state, state-owned entities, the erosion of talent and skills in all these institutions. They had set in untold levels of corruption which had began to define the South African society. Corruption had become endemic. So the new dawn therefore posed a challenge of cleaning up, of reversing this phenomenon of corruption. It also called for the beginning of a process of reconstruction of this institution, perhaps something similar to what we had begun doing when President Nelson Mandela took over in 1994. There we were reforming or radically changing the institutions whose ethos were based in apartheid, and began to bring in ethos that reflected a broader society, a South Africa that belongs to all of us. So this is therefore the context that we saw, and therefore for us it meant the beginning of this very arduous, thoroughgoing task of rebuilding.
Mr. Molefi, the statements of intent in the paragraphs that you've just summarized for the chair are matters that provide a context for the work of the Commission. Obviously, the task of the Commission remains to assess the causes and effects of all the allegations of state capture, fraud, and corruption, and we're dealing now particularly with Transnet, and we have been dealing and we will deal with other state-owned entities. But a question that has been asked of prior witnesses and will no doubt be asked of witnesses who are still to come is, what necessitated a new dawn? In other words, how did it come about that reconstruction or reform was necessary at all? How did it happen that the circumstances in Transnet, for example, were such as to require the actions taken by you?
Chairperson, I have spoken about the erosion of skills, and I have spoken about the weakening of the institution. In the context of Transnet, on or about 2011, the new CEO was appointed to Transnet. A man who was well educated and in many ways was respected, was trained by the government under some of the ministers who are highly respected, like Trevor Manuel and President Mbeki. Brian Molefe was appointed. He became the CEO. But before he became the CEO, the strange thing was that a publication owned by companies owned by a family called the Guptas had already published that he was going to be the CEO of the company.
My apologies for interrupting, Mr. Molefe. Would you pull the microphone closer to you so that you can be heard?
The New Age, which is a publication owned by the Guptas, had already pronounced that Mr. Molefe was going to be the CEO of Transnet. And in our view, therefore, once they came in there, we began to see a process of a collection of individuals with a common purpose that advanced the interests of those who were pursuing quick accumulation of wealth for themselves through certain companies and their linkages to important big businesses, some of which later were awarded contracts by Transnet. And later on, we will show how monies would flow to these companies. And that began to weaken governance within the company, because in order for money to flow to friends who want quick accumulation, systems must be weakened within the company. Governance must be flouted. The rules of procurement, such as the procurement procedure manual of Transnet, public finance management, section 217 of the Constitution, had to be ignored. But also, it was necessary, as I said, to weaken the skills base of the company. But on top there, you would have people who have, we say, a veneer of skills and professionalism. But what is lacking from them is the ethical leadership and the moral values necessary to underpin the qualifications that they have and to ensure that the manner in which they work advances the interests of Transnet as a company.
Mr. Molefi, unless the chair wants to ask any questions concerning that, we can move on to a new topic.
No, we may. I hope that either in the annexures or if not in the annexures, arrangements or attempts will be made to find the New Age article that announced Mr. Molefe's appointment.
Yes, Chair.
Yeah. Other than that, then you may continue.
Perhaps just one question arising from your evidence now, Mr. Molefe. How was it that this operation or these circumstances as you've described were not detected and acted upon? Can you assist the Commission in that regard?
It is very difficult for me to say in detail, but to say that it was a sophisticated operation. It starts off with people who are known to have served the country, the government, who have the qualification, who have been proclaimed as great managers and corporate leaders. But these people, once they are there, therefore, they take control of the mechanisms that provide a countervail against rampant corruption or irregularities in the business. Now, if you looked at the delegations of authority within Transnet, when we came in there, we found that the way in which it was applied was such that an individual could sign off a contract for huge amounts of money, from 500 million to $1 billion, without any reference to the board, save to go to the board only when they decide that it has happened. And that opened up the space for lots of contracts signed in this manner, and contracts that favored certain selected individuals. But the second way in which it was done, it was through a system of confinement. Now, a system of confinement, and I know that the Commission will hear evidence from experts in that regard, is a system that has to be done applied very restrictively. And Treasury regulations and the Transnet procurement procedure manual would require that you use it only if there is extreme urgency, and the urgency must mean that if you don't act, there would be dire consequences for the business or for the lives of the people. Secondly, it is used where you have had probably an equipment from a particular supplier, and you have part of that equipment in operation, and you need therefore to standardize by way of bringing further equipment manufactured and designed along the lines of what you have. And I think the other one relates to very scarce and restricted skills necessary for the business to do its work. In short, Chairperson, confinement would be used in that regard. But because the door was open for confinement, those in authority applied it even in circumstances that did not require that it be applied. And in many instances, and I have become aware of that even after I came onto the board, management would simply delay. When they know that a contract is going to expire, they do nothing about it. They don't issue the RFP on time. And at a very late hour, they come and say, we need to confine this. If we don't confine it, there will be collapse of business. We won't be able to do our work. So it is continuing even now. And I'll respond later on how we are seeking to change that environment and to do things differently.
So the last part that you have said effectively means that management would create a situation of urgency or emergency themselves by not doing what they were supposed to do in time. And then when the contract is about to expire, they say now it's urgent, and if we don't confine it, this will happen, and that they use that to say this is a ground to justify confinement.
That is correct.
Thank you, Chair. In paragraph 7, Mr. Molefe, you deal with the appointment of the new board, which coincided with your own appointment. Would you please tell the Chair of the contents of paragraph 7 of your statement?
Can I make a comment outside that?
Of course.
I must be a very difficult witness for you because I ran away. But I'm sure you will talk to me during break.
I think he just wants you to tell me the gist of paragraph 7.
Chairperson.
May I just add, if you leave here today dissatisfied that you've not been able to tell your whole story, it would be a sad day indeed. So you must feel free to tell the Chair what you believe is important.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Chairperson, Minister Pravin Gordhan was appointed by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and on 23rd of May 2018, he appointed the chair of the board and other 11 members of the board. Their names are set out there. If I'm required to mention the names, I can do so.
It's really up to you.
It was Paul Pretorius, Louis van Ziona, Eshla Fikelipi, Dimakatso Masuha, Ramasela Ganda, Edward Kisweta, who's currently the Commissioner for Revenue Services, and Alwani Ramabulana Foreisani Mofamadi, Dr. Mofamadi, Vivian McMenamin. Now, Vivian has since resigned, so has Professor Kisweta as of yesterday, because he has had to go and start his new job on the 1st. The others are Advocate Mutaung and Gratitude Rampaka. At the time of the appointment of this new board, the acting group CFO, Mr. Mohammed Mahomedi, who by virtue of being the acting group CEO would be a member of the board, an ex-officio member of the board, but he therefore had to be appointed by the minister. He had been appointed earlier on the 15th of May before we got appointed, and he replaced Mr. Gary Peter as the acting Chief Financial Officer of Transnet.
Are there any?
And then, of course, on the 1st of November, with the consent of the minister, the board had then appointed Mr. Tau Mure. The consideration in appointing Mr. Mure was that as a new board coming into this very complex and big organization, and knowing that it has got all these problems that had been reported in the media, we felt that to bring in a new person from outside who didn't understand the organization, when we still don't know who is who in this company, it would have probably been a big mistake, because if the existing management did not cooperate with the new person, it would have been very difficult for the period of the appointment of the individual, for that individual to lead the organization. So Mr. Morwe, from the point of view of seniority and 17 years of knowledge of Transnet, became for us an appropriate candidate to do this job.
Ms. Molefe, you go on to speak in paragraph 8 of the role that the board as a collective must play within Transnet, and perhaps you can also, when dealing with that topic, also deal with the necessary qualifications, if any, that board members must possess in order to occupy their position and carry out their responsibilities.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. The President, in his State of the Nation address, announced that we were going to change the way in which the boards were being appointed. And he said that it must be people who have business background, understanding commerce, good corporate governance, the necessary skills, technical skills, that would inform the board, financial management skills, and so on. Those are some of the considerations that the President referred to, and therefore the board that was appointed is a multidisciplinary board of people who are hardworking, but also ethical, and have the courage to confront the issues facing Transnet as an entity. They are also selfless. They spend long hours working, and they don't get paid for those many hours that they work. And amongst them are young people who should really be spending that time to earn a living, but they've devoted that time to serve Transnet because they recognize that Transnet is a very important company for the country and for the economy. So I'm making that statement. So we therefore, Chairperson as the board that has these skills, understood our responsibility as directing and overseeing the affairs of Transnet. In a normal business, you talk about creating shareholder value, but in the new situation that has unfolded over time, where the question of sustainability become critical as well, the board must also work in a manner that creates a balance, finds a balance between the interests of the shareholder and the interests of the stakeholders. The stakeholders being the customers of the business, being communities in places where Transnet operates, the organized labor, all of those things, and also dealing with issues of the environment. So it is the responsibility of the board to do that. But this responsibility of the Transnet board also include it serving as the deemed board of Transnet National Ports Authority, which is a component of Transnet, but that is prescribed in the National Ports Authorities Act. And of course, it has to do also with managing the subsidiary of Transnet called Transnet International Holdings, which was created in 2017 with the express mandate of exploring trade and development, economic development opportunities in the continent, to see how the skills we have in managing ports, in building rail infrastructure, and operating freight rail businesses could be deployed to assist our neighbors in the continent. So Transnet International is doing that kind of work. They are already doing work in Ghana. They are busy in Kenya. We have been working in Zimbabwe to assist them to turn around their own economy, starting with the movement of the mining goods and all, because they can generate revenue, export revenue out of that. And of course, we are working with Botswana also, whose economy is growing, and we are connecting their rail from Botswana to the parallel right to Richards Bay in KwaZulu-Natal. So broadly, Chairperson, therefore, the role of the board is one of providing strategic direction, but also oversight to on operation, to ensure that there is accountability of management, to ensure that those things that are articulated in the memorandum of incorporation and the shareholder compact are aligned with the actions of management and the work of the board, and the board can account in respect of the requirements of those critical documents, but also that it would ensure that the corporate plan of the business that issues out of the strategy that is developed between the board and management gives rise to key performance indicators within specific key performance areas for each one of the managers of the company, to ensure that each one does their work and that the overall mandate of the company collectively can be achieved. I do hasten to say also that it is the responsibility of the board also to, apart from accounting to the minister, to account to Parliament, but also to ensure that there is compliance with the legislative framework of the country, be it the Companies Act, the relevant provisions of the Constitution, the the King 4 report and so on. All of those provide a gamut of instruments that the board needs to acquaint itself with as it pursues its mandate of making Transnet work. In sum, therefore, Chairperson, the board remains accountable for leading the organization ethically and effectively. It reports to the shareholder representative, being the minister. We're not always going to be perfect in pursuing these things, but what matters is that there is a determination and an effort that is being made to do so.
Mr. Molefi, you don't deal with it directly, but I know it is a matter of concern to the chair of the commission, and that is the oversight that is exercised by Parliament over state-owned entities, and in this case, Transnet. How's that oversight exercised, and do you have any comment on the efficacy of that oversight?
Transnet, Chairperson, resorts under a portfolio committee on public enterprises. From time to time, the Transnet board is required to report to that committee. It has to submit the annual report once the audit has been completed and the report has been submitted to the minister. But it also reports on the program implementation of its program of work and strategy. In recent times, we have had to report on what we are doing about corruption. The first time I went to Parliament, Chairperson, Mr. Gama was still the group CEO of Transnet. The portfolio committee refused to listen to us. They said that they were not going to listen to us if Mr. Gama was there, because they said they told him never to come to Parliament anymore. And they took a view that they would only talk to Transnet board once Transnet has solved the issues of those individuals implicated in rampant corruption within the company. So indeed we couldn't come, but we undertook that once we have dealt with the issues, we'd go back. Indeed, we went back. Now, part of the difficulty, and that is what we discovered when we went to Parliament, was that in the period preceding our appointment, there was lack of transparency from the board of Transnet. Quite often, and I remember, I think it was the date of the 6th of December 2017, when Parliament wanted to meet the board, because the board knew the difficult questions that they were going to be asked, they did not go to Parliament. They stayed away. So they were not opening up. And the refusal to open up was influenced by the fact that there was this denial in Transnet of accepting that there was a capture, the capture of the business, that the business was no longer focused on its mandate adequately. And they sought to explain things differently. I mean, when we wrote the first integrated report, we came in, the audit had already been done. And management wanted me to put, as the chairman of the board, things that say allegation of corruption were leveled against us. I said, no. We're going to write it as corruption that we have become aware of. And that's how we're going to write it, because we don't want to say things that we want to back retreat on. We want to say things that we believe we can continue to maintain going forward. So we went to Parliament, we opened up to Parliament, we told them some of the things that we are saying here to this commission. And Parliament embraced our report. And they made some complimentary statements. We said, we wish this board was there 3 years ago when we met in Transnet. We believe that we would have been far by now in our way. We had a similar experience, Chairperson, with another portfolio committee for trade and industry, which portfolio committee wanted to understand how Transnet complied with the provision of policy on local content and supplier development. We did say that yesterday when the introduction was made, one of the presenters made a distinction to say there are certain components that have to be sourced inside the country, and in respect of the locomotives which Transnet had procured, if you were procuring diesel, electric locomotives, the local content required there would have been 60%. And in respect of diesel locomotives, it would have been 55%. And the DTI has set out designated certain products which must be used, including manufacturing them here locally as part of that procurement process. And Transnet had not reported fully on those matters. We had to do it. And I remember when we got to Cape Town, we had asked management to prepare our presentation. We had to cancel it in Cape Town to say, okay, keep your document. I am going to make 5 points which I am going to use to address Parliament. And it is 5 points which acknowledge our weaknesses, which reflect transparency, which say what we are busy doing to fix the wrongs of the past. We still have to go back to Parliament in January to now report to them on where we are today in enforcing local content and effecting supplier development.
No, I'm grateful that Mr. Pretorius asked you this question, and he's right that it is something that I'm really interested in, also in terms of how Parliament played its oversight role in regard to government departments and SOEs and so on, in regard to periods where there are allegations of all kinds of wrongdoing that one hears happened over a certain period of time. Because it will be important to see to what extent Parliament may have always adopted the kind of attitude that you found when you started as the board with the portfolio committee concerned. Is that the attitude that different portfolio committees had always adopted, or was it different? And if it was different over the years, why was it different? Or are we dealing with a situation where, excuse me, they were trying their best, but there's just certain difficulties, and if there were certain difficulties, were there no mechanisms to assist them to do their job properly? Because I believe that at some stage the Commission must look at if A, B, C, D happened that was wrong, who had the opportunity and the obligation to stop these things from happening? What did they do? What did they not do? And why did they not do what they were supposed to do? Is it connected in any way with state capture? Or is it incompetence? Or is it other things? So it will be important for us to look at all of those things. And maybe somebody like you, because I believe Transnet is not the first state-owned entity in which you get involved. It may be that maybe not this time, maybe some other time you might come and share more experience, because it's important that I get a full picture of different portfolio committees in Parliament and how Parliament has played its role. So I thought I would mention that. Yeah.
Chairperson, the question you raise it's tempting me to go outside the realm of what I'm here for. But I'm going to say just one or two or three things briefly about that.
Yes.
I served as the chairman of the Armaments Corporation of South Africa, ARMSCO, for 2 terms. And I served also, that was from 2004 to 2010. And I served also as the, I normally say chairman of Petroleum and Gas Corporation of South Africa, that is PRASA, for the period 2004 and 2010. And I'm saying chairman because I define myself in line with the Companies Act. Once we change it, I'll call myself what is in the Act.
Yes.
Petrosa.
Petrosa, yeah.
Yes.
Petrosa is Petro-SA, yes, Petrosa. I also served as the chairman of Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, PRASA, which made big headlines in the period following the report of the public protector called Derailed. During that period, Chairperson, I had occasion to interact with portfolio committees, various portfolio committees. They were very robust. And I did not discern anything that suggested that they were not
doing their
regarding
job properly.
their oversight role as important. Towards when I was at PRASA, and we began as a board to confront the issues raised in the public protector report, we went into that extensive investigations. We found that in Parliament, there appeared to be people in the portfolio committee who were being lobbied by those who were defrauding PRASA, because all that they were interested in was trying to stop us from continuing our investigation and insisting that we should move the investigations from where we were conducting them and to give them to law enforcement agencies which had manifested weakness and reluctance to deal with issues. And Chairperson would recall that I have had to compel law enforcement agencies, in particular the Hawks, to go to court and explain to the judge and the people of South Africa why they were reluctant to discharge their constitutional mandate. So from that time we began to see that elements of state capture were incipient in this and in that particular committee. And of course, we saw it beginning now to spread. But I must say that since I joined Transnet, I have designed a definite mind shift and seriousness in dealing with the issues. Scopa, for example, came to visit us. They seemed to have been pretty aware of the state of fear of lower down employees, of the management on top. And I recall in one meeting, they said they're going to talk to the employees of Transnet. They don't want any manager to be there. And they did exactly that. And employees disclosed to them how they were being thoroughly intimidated, that they were not allowed to raise their voice when they see something wrong. So Parliament is doing its work, particularly SCOPA is very robust. And I think that going forward, if this mood that prevails in the country is allowed to grow and spread, we would see a different South Africa and a parliament that plays the kind of role that was envisaged when we conceived it in 1994. And I say when we conceived it because at that time I was also a politician. So I'd like to stop there, Chairperson, because some of these things that I mentioned, I might well have to come back here, as you correctly pointed out.
Yes, I think you probably have a lot of experience. You have mentioned various SOEs in which you have been involved, so you probably could be quite helpful, because to the extent that it may be true that for a certain period, different portfolio committees seemed to be performing their oversight role the way they should, but from a certain period there seemed to be a difference. It might be important to get people who really have experience in regard to those periods. So I think that must be looked at, and from your own point of view, you can reflect, and if really you believe you can help the Commission understand what was happening, then you could really come back and share your observations.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'll certainly go and reflect on that.
Yes.
And just to say that I am willing to assist, because the problems of this country are the problems for all of us.
Yes.
The solution would be one that will benefit all of us.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Mr. Molefe, in paragraph 9, you deal at a general level with issues directly relating to the concept of state capture and its manifestation, as you testify to in Transnet. Many of the points made in paragraph 9 you've already dealt with. Perhaps you can just look at paragraph 9 and say to the Chair, or tell the Chair what points you wish to emphasize from that section of your evidence. And I do have one or two questions arising out of paragraph 9, if I may.
That is where I think I'm a difficult witness, because you ask me something and I go and traverse other paragraphs. but Chairperson, I think the few points that need to be made is that we think that there was a clear pattern of how the capture was implemented. The starting point is to make sure that you capture the decision maker, the person in the top position. Identify all other strategic positions, which positions would play a critical role in the allocation of budgetary resources of the company. So you would capture the group CEO, the group CFO, the treasurer of the company, chief procurement officer, and key people in operating divisions. And this is the pattern that we have seen. And because these people, as I said earlier on, are people who manifest this professionalism and they can show they have qualification, there has not been a way of looking deeper into their ethical values, their ethics and moral values, to see if they are the kind of ethical leaders that the company should have. And it is something that we are going to be dealing with when we interview people for all the strategic positions that we would be appointed to later in Transnet in the next 4 months. So that is one point I want to make. But also I need to say that there are always little cliques of people who are who agree, who share common understanding of how they want to implement procurement processes to benefit their friends outside. And half the time, this collective that works together is a collective that is also known to the people outside and who are defrauding the company. So they collude amongst themselves, they weaken the governance system, and they identify high-value tenders, because that's where big monies are. And quite often, once those tenders have been issued, they would constantly review and extend the scope of the business and of the contract. And when they extend the scope of the contract, they would also then increase capital allocation for that contract. So that's really a few points that I'd like to say, but to indicate that these things that I'm talking about are things that we have experienced in Transnet. I think later on, when we deal further with the evidence, there'll be examples that show what people have done to have money flowing for work that was not done, and out of that money would flow to other entities that are not connected with any service to Transnet.
Mr. Molefe, perhaps this is a convenient time for a break. Chair, with your leave, could we take the short adjournment?
Yes, we'll take a short adjournment, tea adjournment, and we'll resume at 11:30. We adjourn.
All rise.
at paragraph 9, where you make some general observations about the phenomenon of state capture as you understand it, and as you've testified its prevalence in Transnet when you arrived there. Before we leave paragraph 9, may I ask, you speak in paragraph 9.4 of weakening of governance systems. And you say in paragraph 9.5 that that indeed occurred in Transnet. Do you have an example? You mentioned earlier to me in consultation the example of Mr. Richard Valihu in the context of the weakening of governance systems within Transnet.
Sheperson, there are various ways in which this weakening occurs. I did say that at one level you erode the skills simply because, let me start off by saying, those who are committed to the agenda advancing the capture of state-owned companies, which translate broadly into state capture, would seek to would bring in first their own cronies. They surround themselves with cronies. Where they are not able to, and then they seek to turn those who are there but were not their cronies, they seek to turn them into cronies. And when there is a resistance from those upon which an attempt is made to turn them into cronies, they then remove them from the positions that they are holding and make them redundant. And when that moment comes, they appoint to those positions, quite often strategic positions, people who have no knowledge, qualifications, or skills to manage those positions. Because for those who advance the state capture, what is important to them is collusion with them, is acquiescence with them, is not the skills that the company needs. So they do that. And I made the example that you can make is this, that Transnet had an engineer, this time I think he is probably 21 years or 22 years in the company, Richard Valihu. He was running an engineering division, operating division of Transnet. It's engineering operating division. The man is senior, is an engineer. He gets removed. He's substituted for by a teacher. And in Transnet, you would have had a thing called a group leadership team. Sheperson, in your normal knowledge and probably even common sense knowledge, your executive team would comprise the leaders of key operating divisions or units in the business. Because when they meet there, they talk about how they implement their strategy, what needs to be refined in that strategy. That GLT was just a group of friends. They were not linked to operating divisions of the business. But once they were sitting there amongst themselves, they determined how to influence the awarding of tenders. And they do that outside the governance structures of the company. They also put themselves in a position where they attempt to determine what the procurement needs of the business are. So the effect of that was that they are really more like a screening house than a structure that facilitates effective management and operation of the business. And it also meant that the heads of operating divisions of the company did not have easy access to the top structure and even to the group CEO. They have to report to the chief of operations. What happens about what they report, one never knows. Probably they will just get a report that says, no, we don't agree with the proposal that you are making. We're not doing it. So that's how the structure was operating. But what made it even worse, Chairperson, was that it was also a structure that determined what information come to the board of directors. The board of directors was persistently and consistently, let me say consistently, frustrated. Documents which were brought to the board were unprofessional, not properly prepared, and they would come at the last minute to the board, and the board would be required to make decisions about matters that they have not adequately been able to apply their minds to. So that's one of the things. So they then remove people from positions who are good. They put their own people. But they have the structure which behaves in a manner that overrides the governance structures that the governance system of the company had created. Let me give you an example. Transnet has got the internal audit unit. The chief of internal audit ideally should be reporting directly to the audit committee. And if information is given to management, is for information to get them to correct the wrongs that have been picked up by internal audit. But our experience in the organization was that the internal audit unit had to dilute, had to be selective as well on which report would come to the board and to the audit committee. I had said, Chairperson, that I'm a very difficult witness for my evidence leader, but my experience in the investigations we have been doing with M&S was that we could not even get all the internal audit reports from our own internal audit unit because we needed to know what reports are there, what findings, what recommendation, have they been implemented, to what extent, what sanctions were issued, were the sanctions commensurate with the gravity of the offense. Many of the reports and the information that M&S got came from other sources. If you
And
talk
not from
of,
within.
if not from within. So it's this culture of secrecy, this culture of withholding information. Yesterday, in the presentation of evidence, we're told that worksmen could not access certain information they wanted. Yes, it is true. I spoke to worksmen, the man who was leading the investigation team, and I asked him, what does it mean for the report then that you have prepared? It said, no, our findings are fundamental, nothing will change. But it will not be changed by the fact that there might be some information we didn't get. So that's what he said. But that's the difficulty you have. M&S, if you take the example of UBEC Kobeka, that we
yeah,
spoke
Quebec.
about
Yeah.
Isol
Yesterday,
yesterday. A man has had to go to Zulu-Natal to go and get it there. They've had to talk to a number of audit firms to say, man, please give us. We understand that you did this investigation for Transnet. Where is the report? So that's the difficulty we had in trying to get to the root of corruption, knowing the truth so that we can fix the organization. So clearly, you have people there resisting. And that is what we mean when we say there is a fight back, because they don't only do that, then they will disseminate information calculated to tarnish the image of those who are cooperating. So that's how I think they then weaken the system and achieve their objectives.
Well, before you proceed, let me just ask this. I would have thought that if somebody is employed by Transnet as, for argument's sake, head of the audit unit, and therefore as the person who should be in possession or should have custody of certain reports relating to Transnet that have something to do with auditing and so on, that if there are reports that are supposed to be with him, and he is approached or she is approached, and if they are there, that person is obliged to make them available to whoever Transnet has said may be given those reports. And if they are not there, maybe you might understand with one, but also you might check, well, somebody else must have it. It can't be that if you don't have it, nobody has it. But if you begin to have a number of reports which are supposed to be there within the possession of that person or official, and he or she is refusing or keeps on coming up with excuses, certain consequences should follow, and I would imagine that those are being taken. But I don't know whether the basis in which attempts are made that you don't get the reports are such that it's difficult to take disciplinary action.
Sheperson, in an ideal situation, and things being equal, you would expect that a person entrusted with certain responsibilities and who is accountable to and loyal to the company would understand that they have the obligation to give information to the company when it is required. But the situation is not normal. We have begun acting on a number of these individuals, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so until we get right to the last person in the chain. So that we are dealing with.
No, thank you. Because it's obvious that such a person is not in possession of a report such as that in his or her personal capacity. It's not his or hers, it's Transnet's. And the only reason why he or she has control is because she or he is in that position where Transnet has put them. You know. But I think you have given an indication that something is being done. Thank you.
Mr. Molefe, in paragraph 9.4, you also mention the practice of recruiting what you refer to as reputable consultancies. Would you explain that, please, to the Chair?
Chair, the reputable companies, in order to, our consultancies are appointed or recruited as part of the agenda of the these individuals. let's take an example. McKinsey is a globally recognized company. You would not fault it. Their knowledge is just, until recently, it has been impeccable. But if you look at the investigations into Transnet, and even in, well, what we have seen in the reports about ESCOM, they got embroiled in instances where they got monies for work that they did not do. The former acting group CEO of Transnet considered that an employee of McKinsey wrote his research for his dissertation that he was doing for his master's degree. And McKinsey is a service provider of Transnet. We don't understand why it was necessary. He made that admission, and McKinsey told me that they have investigated it. He made the admission, and they disciplined the person. So reputable companies are brought in, but then they get harnessed to an agenda, a strategy, a program that advances an agenda that doesn't serve Transnet, or that facilitates the siphoning of funds from Transnet.
So from what you have said, at least in terms of your understanding, it seems that people who were pursuing the agenda of state capture, the agenda of capturing SOEs, but at least certainly with Transnet in your experience, sometimes they would try and make use of individuals who enjoy, because of the past, who enjoy good reputation as managers, who are well educated, who have done well up to a certain point, and then, but once they have got them, they use them, or they get them to do wrong things. And then, but you say sometimes they would use people who might not have the requisite qualifications and experience. Like you said, you made the example of an engineer of 21 years experience in Transnet being replaced by a teacher in relation to a unit that deals with engineering, as I understood the position. And you are now saying sometimes consultancies would also be brought in who have a good reputation, internationally, but then they are used to do wrong things.
It is correct, sir. I think in the evidence that probably would be given by, the acting group chief financial officer, some of these things would be elaborated further. And I know I've got a bit of it in my statement.
Yes.
When you deal with the question of capital raising, dealing, which historically were done by the treasury of Transnet, whose expertise was world acclaimed. But then someone in a strong top position, who's chief financial officer, collude with a consultancy to marginalize treasury of the company, to make them redundant, and they take over. They do what treasury would have done and get billions out of that, millions and millions out of that as a fee. And they would say capital raising fee. I mean, if you think of how capital raising was done in respect of the locomotives, in particular for, I think it was China South Rail, we had a similar experience, and then people walk away with millions of money. So they have now weakened Treasury, because I am sure that I'm almost certain that one of the individuals who was there in the Treasury would be called by the Commission, who, when she saw this, and I've had occasion to talk to her, said she told them that what was happening in the company was so grossly wrong. And she said to them, I came here with my integrity. I tell you now, I'm going to leave this company with my integrity. I'm not going to allow the happenings in this business to compromise my integrity and my professionalism. So, but these are the things that are happening. Many of them were happy to sell sell their reputation, their integrity, on the altar of making quick money, and not thinking about the future of the country, even their own future, because it's something quick you get and we catch you, you lose everything that you had, which you would have kept if you had been an honest citizen of the country.
Thank you.
Mr. Molefi, in the remainder of paragraph 9, you refer to and you quote the report of the Public Protector, which gave rise to the appointment of this commission. You also deal with a certain report of the Public Affairs Research Institute, and you deal with what have become known as the Gupta leaks. Is there anything you wish to add to those observations by way of background to what is to follow?
It is the first difficult question I have to answer. Crisply, the report of the Public Protector, which is titled Investigation into Alleged Improper and Unethical Conduct by President and State Functionaries relating to the alleged, it's called the capture of, state of capture. I think that's the name of the report. Details clearly some of the things that I have said, how those seeking to capture the state set out to do so, and mainly at the heart of which was the Gupta family. And in Transnet, Sheperson, you'll see that in many of instances where monies were lost, they were channeled to companies linked with this particular family. But the Commission would also have received evidence from people who had been heads of government departments, who have shown how, when they did not acquiesce in the manipulation of tenders or defrauding of the state, they found themselves out. People like James Maseko and others. And the same applies to the government itself. So, how some of people, and the evidence was led here, how some of the people who had been suspended, disciplined, and were out of the business were later brought in when a minister allegedly captured by this family was appointed to the position, and suddenly that person came back into the position. So we saw that, and of course, the other report, Chairperson, which we refer to here, is one in May 2017 by the Public Affairs Research Institute, PARI, which published what was considered to be a groundbreaking study on state capture called the Betrayal of the Promise. And it shows how South Africa was stolen. Maybe a bit of an exaggeration, but it is quite clear when now the facts come out that indeed the country was on the edge of the cliff. So was Transnet itself as a company, with its very critical role that it plays to the economy. And then, of course, you have all those thousands of emails, correspondence between the Gupta families and various officials in state entities and government departments, which were leaked and which have been established to be a fact now by many investigations that subsequently ensued. And I'm advised by my lawyers that most of these things that I'm talking about, these reports and the correspondence and so on, are in the possession of the Commission. Chair, I would like to leave it there, but I'm happy to maybe try better if there's a need for me to elaborate more.
No, that's fine. What you can do afterwards, if there are issues that you feel you might wish to share with the Commission, you can be in touch with the legal team and arrangements can be made, because you know, you might have a certain perspective on some of the issues that are covered by one or other report. So we would like to make sure that if you've got something that you believe is important, it's not left out unless it's really been captured already, been taken care of.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Yeah,
I hope my attorneys are taking notes.
Yes, they should take notes, otherwise you might be reluctant to pay them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Molefe, in paragraph 10, you describe in general terms what the new board found upon its appointment at Transnet. And for example, in paragraph 10.3, you use fairly strong language in relation to your discoveries on your appointment. You talk of, for example, total paralysis, and you talk of a horror show. Now, if you could assist the Commission, please, to understand the facts and circumstances that you discovered on your arrival at Transnet in your position as board chair, those facts and circumstances which led you to draw the conclusions you've drawn in your statement.
Thank you, Chairperson. Many of these things are contained. There's a combination of things. Those that we are contained in the reports of the investigations, MNS and Waxman's. And then others, of course, are those that we became aware of through whistleblowers. If I'm allowed, Chairperson, I'm not going to go through what I've written in my statement.
Yeah, you may do
The
that.
evidence leader is happy with that. I just want to say that we refer to paralysis, total paralysis. The examples to support that would be, let me take this one. Sometimes, I think 2000 and...
I'm sorry, Mr. Molefe. 1 second. Maybe they can switch on the aircon, but not too much. All right, it's a little hot now. Maybe it's hot for people. Let me check. Can I find out whether anybody feels that it's hot inside here? I had earlier on said they should put down the aircon. Well, it doesn't look like anybody is particularly feeling any heat.
No one is saying so.
Okay, the relevant people will monitor, and when necessary, they will switch it on, but not too much.
Yes, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Molefe.
By way of emphasis, Chairperson, let me repeat part of this statement. We say that it is not an exaggeration to state that the board was astonished by the widespread corruption and willful disregard of the rules. So these rules pertain to policy on procurement, processes that must be followed by various procurement, supply chain management structures, each one of which had a defined role. They were disregarded. And some of these examples you see in the manner in which the new hotel confinement and procurement was done. So we go further to say that that kind of a situation, the prevalence of this rampant disregard for systems and rules and mechanisms put in place suggests that there is a state of paralysis that has set in. And we argue that the way in which monies would be siphoned off and nothing being done to stop it. For those of us who were accustomed to working in the interest of the businesses and the country, it represented what I called a horror show. It looked more like a movie or a theater where those who are in key positions and made decisions were the protagonists, the main actors. So that is what it does. Let me give one example. As we were busy doing our job, we were made aware that we needed to do a road show, visit the National Port Authority and Transnet Port Terminal. So we went to Durban. Having received the report of the whistleblowers and having seen some correspondence from complainants who had entered into lease arrangement with Transnet, I've asked that management should take the board of directors to the old Durban port. Now, the old Durban port, when it was discontinued on the back of the opening of the new Durban International Port, it was purchased from AXA by Transnet for 1.9 billion rand. ostensibly to create a dig-out port in Durban as an extension of the facility to assist the port to deal with the congestion that was building up in Durban.
Are you talking of the land that comprised the old airport at Durban?
Yes, the land that comprised the old airport was bought by Transnet.
Had it belonged to somebody else before? Must have.
It belonged to EXA, the airports companies of South Africa,
Oh,
because
okay.
they are the ones who were paid the money
Okay.
for that land. And the airports companies of South Africa is a company that is renowned for efficient management of various airports here in South Africa and outside South Africa. I think they go as far as India in doing that job. Indeed, later after the dig-out port, the land was bought on which construction was to commence in 2020. There was a downturn in the economy, and Transnet itself had begun to experience over a period of time a decline in volumes for exports. So there was a postponement of construction of that land. But what was strange is that when we got to that airport, we found that there were a number of businesses that had moved in to occupy what was Transnet land. There were logistics companies, and there was one company that had a huge 100 by 100 square meter warehouse where they were cutting tires and manufacturing some kind of products and storing cement. There was no lease arrangement between them and Transnet. They were there. Transnet was not getting money into its account. There were others there who were running events management businesses. They were running restaurants that they had opened there. And management of Transnet, the chief operations officer, including the then chief executive, Mr. Gama, pretended that they did not know that these illegals occupied the land. After much engagement, Mr. Gama said to me, yeah, they have occupied the land, but you know, there are laws in our country which say that we may not remove squatters unless we can provide to them an alternative accommodation. Clearly, that provision of the law would not have applied to rogue businesses who behave like mafia and came to occupy the land that belonged to a company that is owned by the taxpayers of South Africa. But that's what happened. So for years they were there. We ask ourselves the question, they must have been paying money. Who were they paying money to? They must have been assured that you can occupy this land, you can build a factory here in a warehouse, nothing is going to happen to you. Because the assessment we made was that that factory was built for close on to 50 million rand. Nobody spends 50 million if there is uncertainty, if there is a risk. So they were assured by management. Now, I'm mentioning these things to show the problems we have had, this paralysis that we're talking about, this horror show we are referring to. At the same time, in the same place, Transnet had signed a lease agreement with a company called SeaWorld. SeaWorld was going to operate that place over 10 years, begin to run domestic flight businesses like Lanseria, linking up with Lanseria. After 10 years, they would give it back to Transnet. They could not operate because other more powerful people had occupied that place, and Transnet management did not deal with them. Of course, they have now taken them to court. There are several litigations to get them out of the land. They also occupy that land without permission of the city of eThekwini. So now this is the horror show we're talking about. This is paralysis that we're talking about. Money can't come into the company. Nothing can be done because people who are there and are friends of people in top positions can stay there and nobody can do anything about it.
You say in paragraph 10.4, Mr. Molefe, that the ability of the board to tackle these issues was not immediately possible and was negatively affected by a number of factors, and you list those factors in paragraph 10.4.1 to 10.4.3. You've already mentioned some of them, but perhaps you want to summarize your evidence in that regard.
Chairperson, I referred to that structure that I called the screening house, the structure that selected what may come to the board. So they kept the secret. This Durban dig-out port story is one of the secrets that they kept away from the board. There are many others which we deal with later. Well, the biggest one, which almost collapsed Transnet, we'll talk about it, and which only came about as a result of the qualified audit report, but we'll come and deal with it later on. So we had that problem. We couldn't get information. No employee could simply talk to directors because that's like a regimental arrangement in the company. It's like a command system in the army. If the commander has not commanded you, instructed you to do something, nobody does anything. And if the commander chooses not to instruct you to do the right thing, so you got to stay with the wrong thing, which is what was happening and made it very difficult for the board. If people spoke to directors, they would be called aside and asked, you've got no right to be talking to the directors. We, the top management, are the only ones who talk to the directors. So you got, if visitors come to the to Transnet, employees must be scared to talk to them. And that is why Scopa, when it came there, it says, we don't want you management because we know that the employees will not talk if you are there. We want to talk them alone, which is what I have also done when I go to port terminals. We tell management to go and allow the employees to tell us about their problems and what they think we should be doing, which we are not doing. So that's the culture we are doing, because it's important that we encourage a culture of openness, a culture of transparency, a culture of participation without any fear in the affairs of the business.
You mention names in paragraph 10.5. Would you deal with those, please?
Well, in the Chairperson, in the reports that we got, and when we look at the history of the transactions that happened there, we identify three key protagonists, three actors, we call them the architects, and the implementers of the capture of the state. And these were Mr. Brian Molefe, Mr. Anoj Singh and Mr. Siabonga Gama. The records and exhibits will show that they signed for some of these big and irregular contracts, including deviations or confinement, even changing the procurement evaluation criteria for some of these tenders in order to facilitate entry of those companies which were their darlings, which later on we saw that they siphoned money out of Transnet. And then, of course, you had a man who was chairing the board acquisition and disposal committee, Mr. Iqbal Sharma, who was a business associate of Salem Esa, a darling of the Guptas, and the guy who had all solutions for the Guptas and was running their businesses. Mr. Iqbal Sharma was working for Transnet, and they were associated. I think that business was called VR Laser, which we know was also involved with Denel, and it associated with other companies that then procured business with Transnet. Clearly, this is the abrogation of corporate governance rules and a gross violation of fiduciary duties of directors and senior management of the business. And all of these people, including Mr. Sharma, were people who were appointed by Minister Gigaba when he took over as Minister of Public Enterprises. It's a matter of public record that he was a big buddy of the Guptas. He has been called several times to the Saxon world. I think I was unlucky. They probably didn't know my name. They never asked me to go there. You know, the opportunity ended before they could call me.
Yes.
You've also dealt, Mr. Molefe, to some extent with the matters raised by you in paragraph 10.6 and 10.7. Is there anything in those paragraphs that you feel you should add to what you've already said?
Not much of substance, Chairperson. Safe to say that we make a point that the manner in which these individuals operated, they treated Transnet as their piggy bank. You know, the little bank that kids play with, they put in money, they take it out. Transnet was that kind of a thing that they could put in money, take it out at will. But I think they were taking more out than they would have put in anything. And in this context, they would have been diverting funds to various entities through these nefarious methods of inflating the prices and changing the scope of contracts so that you justify increase of the cost. And they were also using these advisory services somewhere in the exhibits. The Honorable Chair will see that Trillion would be paid money for the work that they had not done for Transnet. I think we'll probably see it later. It's probably in the region of 93 million rand, which was paid to them. This was all part of this sophisticated game that was being played by those in power.
Paragraphs 10.8 to 10.10, Mr. Molefe, similar observations apply. You've dealt with issues raised in those paragraphs. And in paragraph 10.9, by way of summary, you talk of three basic pillars of the corruption and model of state capture, as you refer to it, that was prevalent in Transnet when you arrived. Do you wish to add or mention those three pillars by way of summary? Paragraph 10.9.
All of them, okay. We did refer to them, that we did say that a particular model of capture and corruption was constructed based on basic pillars. I did say that those pillars would be, you are either with us or without us, against us. So employees who did not support the agenda were dismissed, they were transferred elsewhere, or they were rendered redundant. In this connection, I must say we found many hardworking, loyal, and experienced employees pushing paper and not knowing what they are doing. There are still there, many of them, and we're in the process of doing this. We also know that those who could not stomach this kind of behavior resigned, not because they wanted to go, but because they felt that they had no future. But this organization needs the skills that they have. And we are in the process of bringing them back, provided that in doing so, we would not find ourselves to be acting in conflict with any law of our country, because we think the company needs them. And we do say that, look, they introduce new methods, procurement methods, or they flouted decision making in respect of our procurement processes. They use systems that facilitated state capture. You ask me how. I think probably Neotel again would provide an extractive example, where normally the process of determining the business needs, the quality and the scope, or the quality of product required and the scope of work would originate from the owner of business. When we look at what had happened at a certain point with regard to Neotel, the memorandum comes from the top. It doesn't come from the owner of business. And it ends up being endorsed by the CEO of the operating division and management, and they get settled with a mess of dysfunctional equipment which was obsolete, and which later on, of course, the company would have been required to buy it back. So it's one example that we have seen. And we have said also, Chairperson, that reprisals were enforced. There were concoction, fabrication of charges, and people subjected to disciplinary hearings, found guilty and fired. Some of them are subjected to these disciplinary hearings on matters that they know they are not guilty of, But in the end, because they have considered that they are unwanted in the business, they go away. So this has been the method that has been used by those in power, and the culture that had developed was that you don't ask your superior questions. You don't debate with your superior. You just listen and carry out orders. That had been the culture. And it is a culture we are seeking to reverse. It is very difficult because it had become not only a culture but a practice within the organization. Now we've got to turn that around. If we have to unchain the creativity, innovation, and talent of the many employees who understand this business, love it, and are committed to working.
Well, part of what you are telling me in terms of people who may have been seen to resist attempts to get them to be involved in wrongdoing, that they were the disciplinary charges were brought against them and they were suspended and they were dismissed, or things were made difficult for them, with the result that some would leave, seems consistent with what I've been told by other witnesses in relation to, for example, the law enforcement agencies. Of course, I will still hear more evidence and see whether there are any witnesses who dispute that analysis, but what you are saying seems to be consistent with what they told me, or some of the witnesses in the law enforcement agency told me was happening in that sector as well.
It is indeed consistent, Chairperson. Without getting into the details, I've had the opportunity to work with law enforcement agencies when I was chairman of PRASA.
Yes.
We started off very well. We had professional police officers who were doing a good job.
Yes. Yes.
And we gave them files and files of evidence. They agreed to work with our forensic investigators because they had lack of capacity in that area.
Yeah.
Then, of course, when the president changed the head of the Hawks and brought in a gentleman called Bering Tlemeza, he got in there and he removed all these good people. And we started getting the story of files which were disappearing, the work we had given not been done. As I'm sitting here now, talking in this commission, there are volumes of evidence sitting there with the Hawks, which they are yet to go to the National Director of Prosecution to deal with. It is precisely for that reason that I had to haul them before the courts and say, do your job. And it was a simple thing, do your job. You discharge your constitutional mandate. I'm not asking you to do something that's not part of your responsibility and your duties. So there is a correlation between what we have painted here and what happened to these law enforcement agencies.
But what's quite important in relation to the last bit that you have said about the law enforcement agencies is you are not basing that on what you may be reading in the newspapers or in the hearing in the media. You are basing it on your experience as chairperson of PRASA at a certain time when, from a certain time, the Hawks seemed to have good people who were keen on their job, doing it properly, but from a certain time, your experience showed that things began to be different. That's personal experience in matters in which you were involved in that capacity.
Certainly, Chairperson. I sat with some of the senior people. I've never sat with Mr. Ntlemeza because he was not there. He came in, and when he came in, they stopped doing the job. But I sat in meetings with his deputy, who is still there now. I needed to have added one point, Chairperson, which when I spoke about reprisals and disciplinary hearings,
Yes.
to say that justice in Transnet was applied selectively, where the person implicated in reports was somebody who knew a lot about the wrongs of some of the people in senior positions. That person would be charged, but deliberately, not enough evidence would be adduced before the disciplinary hearing.
Yes.
We had one example where there was a devastating report, for example, on the matter of the NMPP, National Multi-Product Pipelines. And that report, during the disciplinary hearing, was not used. The result was that the person was not found guilty. So it is deliberate because they had the report, but they didn't want to use it. Transnet lawyers or lawyers instructed by Transnet were either not made privy to that report or they did not ask for the report. But Transnet, knowing the gravity of the transgression, the offense, they should have used it, but they didn't. But on smaller persons, individuals, they descend heavily on. They punish them. They fire them from work.
Well, it might not be exactly the same thing that some of the witnesses in the law enforcement sector told me, but they did say that in regard to persons or officials who seem to be fighting corruption, there seem to be quite determination to get them arrested, charge them criminally, even when either there was no case or if there was something that done wrong was really a minor thing. But when it was certain other people, then even if there was clear evidence, nothing would be done against them in terms of arrest or being suspended or charged or transferred. Or when it was done in such a way that they would not be found guilty or something like that. I hope I'm not misrepresenting what they told me, but there was something like that. But I just mentioned to say that there is also that came from a different sector. Thank you.
It is so, Chairperson. That's our observation from where we are sitting, what we have seen, but I've also seen it by working closely with law enforcement agencies.
Yes. Thank you.
There was a point I wanted to make. Maybe I can make it once Advocate Pretorius concludes that paragraph 10. But if you allow me, Chairperson, I can just rattle on and say that...
yes, Mr. Pretorius, is that fine in terms of your own planning?
Well, I was coming to paragraph 10.12 and had a few questions in relation to the manner in which the board responded to what it found and began its own series of investigations.
I was going to do something, say something before that paragraph 10.
Okay, maybe say so. Yeah,
and that
say
is
it, yeah.
10:11.
Yes.
Basically where we say that one of our primary tasks was to investigate the extent of abuse of procurement processes at Transnet and to make sure that we clean up the mess as much as possible. I think to this extent, there are a number of these big matters we're dealing with. One of them is that the Durban dig-out port I referred to earlier. The other one is that one of the cranes, which has been dealt with. We received further whistleblowing reports in respect of the multi-product pipelines that I've spoken about. We still have to look at how to use that information. I'm advised that we have approximately 400,000 documents which came as a result of the whistleblower, and MNS attorneys went to collect it in Durban. And the whistleblower says you stand a chance of recovering 12 billion rand that Transnet has lost. But I don't know if people would have been sitting in the 12 billion rand, but it is worth demonstrating to the South African public that we are acting decisively. So we will deal with that. You might ask, Chairperson, but what mechanism have you created to make sure that matters that you have not referred to in your evidence here are followed up, are not allowed to disappear? We are working on that. We have recently received approval from National Treasury in the use of transversal contracts to use forensic investigators who are on their panel. And the intention is to make sure that we move rapidly. We don't go through tedious processes of trying to find investigators through a public tender. Of course, even as we do that, we would still have to go through Transnet procurement to achieve that. But we are looking at that. These cases that I'm referring to would go to them. Yesterday, Advocate Pretorius said Transnet is no longer at the Carlton Center. Transnet has moved now to Waterfall Corner, and he said, well, this might be the subject of investigation. I don't know who whispered to him. It is indeed the subject of investigation. I should have seen the preliminary report of it yesterday or today. It has not been brought, but it is the subject of investigation. Some of the strange things that have happened and the questions that I've asked management was, how could it be so coincidental that Waterfall Corner, the building you want, is occupied by a Group 5. Group 5 has a 5-year contract, a lease. Group 5 has used 2 years of that lease. And suddenly, Transnet comes in and takes a lease of 3 years in the same building. Is this not a bailout of some kind? Because in my personal experience, if you had a lease, the landlord would have said to you, you can't leave my property now unless you find me a tenant who will take the remainder of your contract. So it is that red flag that we would pursue. From where I'm sitting, I've been privy to some of the emails that suggested that, in fact, even before the RFP went out, there had been discussions between management of Transnet, management of Group 5, management of a company called Attack, which is a listed property company of why do I forget the holding company? Well, I will remember it. But there had been those discussions. And we also look at how the RFP was designed. Transnet needed a lot of parking space if it was to move everybody from the Carlton Center to the Waterfall Corner. It would also have needed additional space to accommodate executives coming from the operating divisions when they come to the meetings of EXCO. But Transnet did not do that. It designed the parking requirements to suit what exists already there in that building. The result being that when there is EXCO, members of our management, top executive team, they don't have place to park. So it's one of those things that would be investigated. There are many more similar ones, and we would be using this the panel of National Treasury to follow up on these things. There are other things which Fundutsi in its report became privy to, but they were falling outside their mandate, but they reflect the violations of procurement and other things happening within Transnet. They would have to be packaged as well and included in the next phase of our investigations.
You deal in paragraph 10.12, Mr. Molefe, with the beginnings of the review process embarked upon by the new board, and a number of high-value tenders were identified in that process. We're going to deal with some of them in your evidence in due course, but as you yourself have stated, the question arises, what about the possibility of malfeasance outside of those high-value tenders? And you've told the chair about some of the activities of the board in that respect. May I refer you to a statement you made, public statement you made? It's not part of the bundle, Chair, but it will be handed up in January 2019. It's in the business report, and it's under the headline, Transnet reviews thousands of contracts and cleanup. And towards the end of the article, you're quoted as saying that Transnet would spend a significant amount of time going through a pile of contracts, which you, Mr. Molefi, estimated to be in the thousands that the company had entered into during the past few years. And you are quoted as saying, the reality is that once that exercise is completed, the 8.1 billion rand reported in irregular expenditure last year, that number could be significantly higher. Did you make that statement?
That is correct, Chairperson, I did.
Do you have anything to add? How is it that
and I did not suck the number 1,000 from my finger. I had a discussion with our Treasury and the Acting Chief Financial Officer and said, what would it take for us to get to the bottom of this corruption? It is quite clear that when we came in, the focus was on the 1064 locomotives, on Neotel, on T-Systems, as well as 95 and 100 locomotives procurement. But the reality is that there are many others falling outside that, which if indeed we want to clean up, would have to deal with. So the statement is correct, and we are committed to doing so. And one of the things that items that we are already dealing with, on which there's a preliminary report, is one relating to what is called Ambrose Park, is the land of Transnet, where Transnet was attempting to create an opportunity for emerging oil and gas businesses to establish there. But unfortunately, whilst economic transformation, inclusiveness, and empowerment are necessary, some opportunists circumvented the processes. So we're looking at that. And it's a complex thing, Chairperson, because the companies that signed these lease agreements with Transnet themselves did not want to defraud Transnet, unless they might have been giving kickbacks to somebody. Is that somebody inside Transnet chose not to follow the process. The result was that once those companies had signed the lease agreement, they spent millions. I spoke to one company that says, we have already put 100 million into this thing. So Transnet, in resolving these matters, it is going to have to find a balance between dealing robustly with compliance with the procurement system, but also deal with the impact that our failures as Transnet has had on innocent businesses. Perhaps that is probably the point at which lawyers would call about just and equitable arrangement.
Yes, yes, yes.
Mr. Molefe, in embarking upon the project or projects that the board has chosen to, have you found a change in relation to the readiness of whistleblowers to come forward?
Yes, Chairperson, increasingly South Africans in and outside Transnet, employees of Transnet, are coming forward disclosing information which hitherto we would not have been able to access. And we think that it augurs well for the process of changing the culture, rebuilding and rebuilding the institution, and restoring public confidence in state-owned companies.
Mr. Molefe, at paragraph 10.12.1 and following, you deal at a high level and in summary with some of the larger contracts which have been reviewed through your investigations or through the investigations that you've mandated your legal representatives and others to undertake. Shall we start first with the issue of the 95 locomotives at paragraph 10.12.2? If you could tell the Chair in summary what investigations have revealed.
The key investigation in this regard, investigations were MNS and Fundoti, especially Fundoti. And the investigations reveal that, again, as is prevalent in Transnet at the time, as was prevalent in Transnet at the time, procurement processes were flouted, prices were increased. If you look at these two, they start off with Transnet saying we need to confine because we got to prepare our locomotives are aging. There's a number of them which will be phased out. They will go out of service, so we need to move rapidly. Now, there were companies that had provided service at this stage. I recall one of them was Mitsui. I think it's called Mitsui, yeah?
That's M-I-T-S-U-I.
M-I-T-S-U-I.
Yes.
It had previously provided locomotives of the type that Transnet required. And management advised that in order to ensure that the costs are not high, that we manufacture these locomotives quickly and therefore can deploy them in service as quickly as possible. The confinement should be in Mitsui. They have the design, they have the production line, So they're not going to spend time still trying to figure out how to design that locomotives. And that is where probably the question of standardization would have arisen in that regard, and which is provided for in confinement and in the deviations of National Treasury regulations. If I recall well, it should be Regulation 16 or so. But China South Rail entered. Things changed. What was initially intended to be a confinement to Mitsui was now changed. It was made a confinement now to China South Rail, which did not have the design that Transnet required at that time, and therefore Transnet ends up with a locomotive design that they did not require. And again, the business owner, which would have been TFR, would have said, this is the kind of locomotives we want. It gets up there to the big bosses at corporate. They decide, no, you're not gonna get what you want. You will get what we say is good for you. You're not gonna get what you want, which would be cheaper for Transnet. You're gonna get what we say is good for you, and which will lead to escalation in terms of price, but you must pay that price. I just want to make that point. I know that the details will be dealt with by other witnesses who were more into operation and were dealing with issues of governance and procurement. They are experts in that regard.
We know from investigations that there were 3 contracts in relation to, well, many more than 3 contracts, but 3 categories of contract in relation to the procurement of locomotives. That's the procurement of the 95 locomotives, then the procurement of 100 locomotives, and then the procurement of the 1064 locomotives. Those issues have been raised yesterday and will be the subject of further evidence. You summarize separately in relation to the 95, the 100, and the 1064, the findings. You've dealt with the 95, I think, and in paragraph 10.12.4, you summarize the findings in respect of the 100 locomotives. Would you just summarize those for the chair, please? That's in paragraph 10.12.4.1 and following.
Chairperson, I identify the irregularities in respect of the acquisition of 100 locomotives. And I did say that already what was initially intended to be a confinement to Mitsui now shifted to become a confinement of the 100 locomotives to China South Rail. And this was not in compliance with the requirement of urgency, standardization, and highly specialized goods as prescribed by the policy and of course the Treasury regulation. So it's one of those things. So it's irregular. That's Funduti has found that. So did MNS investigators.
Was there any escalation of cost that raised concern?
I'm coming to that. The investigations, the reports show that the China South Rail proposal did not meet the objectives of confinement as set out in the memorandum of 21st January 2014, which had been approved by the Transnet Board of Directors. And then, of course, that in response to the question by Advocate Pretorius SC, It is indeed true that the acquisition cost escalated from 3.8 billion to 4.4 billion. And this memorandum was submitted by Mr. Brian Molefe, Mr. Singh, and Mr. Gaba, justifying the increases. So I'm advised from the investigations that Transnet overpaid at least 3.47 million per locomotive, and at most paid 6.2 million per locomotive.
Overpaid.
Sorry, overpaid, yes, overpaid by that amount, sorry. And the conclusion was that Messrs. Molefe, Brian Molefe, B.S. Gama, Singh, and Gianni had failed in discharging their fiduciary duties in the acquisition of 100 locomotives for China South Rail. The fiduciary duties being one that requires care and diligence. And these are the things that show that willfully people could just ignore the rules.
Chair, it's 2 minutes to 1. We're about to move to a new topic. Would it be convenient now to take the long adjournment?
Okay, we'll take the lunch adjournment and we'll resume at 2 o'clock. We adjourn.
Hey man, you guys, why are you busy taking photos when you are pointing at me alone? You make